Lhasa, the People's Republic of Tibet. The world's most populous city is still recovering from the results of last week's general election. The Social Democrats have smashed the Yamas party in a landslide victory, and the streets are still roaring with revelers. I'm at Nuri Televaldi at a crowded sidewalk cafe, and we have to shout over the U-Board din. Before the outbreak started, overland smuggling was never popular. To arrange for passports, the fake tour buses, the contracts, and protection on the other side all took a lot of money. Back then, the only two lucrative routes were into Thailand or Myanmar. Where I used to live in Kashi, the only option was into the ex-Soviet republics. No one wanted to go there, and that's why I wasn't initially a chateau. I was an importer. Raw opium, uncut diamonds, girls, boys, whatever was valuable for those primitive excuses for countries. The outbreak changed all that. Suddenly we were besieged with offers, and not just from, Lincoln Grangu, but also from, people on the up and up. I had urban professionals, private farmers, and even low-level government officials. These were people who had lots to lose, and they didn't care where they were going. They just needed to get out. Do you know what they were fleeing from? We had heard rumors. We even had an outbreak somewhere in Kashi. The government had hushed it up pretty quickly, but we guessed we knew something was wrong. Didn't the government try to shut you down? Officially they did. Penalties on smuggling were hardened, border checkpoints were strengthened, they even executed a few chateaux, publicly, just to make an example. If you didn't know the true story, if you didn't know it from my end, you would think it was an effective crackdown. And you're saying it wasn't? I'm saying I made a lot of people rich. Border guards, bureaucrats, police, even the mayor. These were still good times for China, where the best way to honor Chairman Mao's memory was to see his face on as many 100-yen notes as possible. So, you were that successful? Kashi was a boom town. I think 90%, maybe more, of all westbound overland traffic came through with even a little left over for air travel. Air travel? Yeah, well, just a little. I only dabbled in transporting Renshi by air. A few cargo flights now and then to Kazakhstan or Russia. Small-time jobs. It wasn't like the East, where Gundong and Jiangsu were getting thousands of people out every week. Could you elaborate on that? Sure. Air smuggling became big business in the eastern provinces. These were rich clients, the ones who could afford pre-booked travel packages and first-class tourist visas. They would step off the plane at London or Rome or even San Francisco, check into their hotels, go out for a day of sightseeing, and simply vanish into thin air. That was big money. I always wanted to break into air transport. But what about infection? Wasn't there a risk of being discovered? That was only later, after Flight 575. Initially, there weren't too many infected taking these flights. If they did, they were in the very early stages. Air transport shuttle were very careful. If you showed any signs of advanced infection, they wouldn't go near you. They were out to protect their business. The golden rule was, you couldn't fool foreign immigration officials until you fooled your shuttle first. You had to act completely healthy. Even then, it was a race against time. Before Flight 75, we heard one story about a couple, a very well-to-do businessman and his wife. He had been bitten. Not a serious one, you understand, but one of the slow burns, where all the major blood vessels are missed. I'm sure they thought there was a cure in the West. A lot of the infected did. Apparently, they reached their hotel room in Paris and had just begun to collapse. His wife tried to call the doctor, but he forbade it. He was afraid they would be sent back. Instead, he ordered her to abandon him and leave now in the commotion. And the hotel staff finally ignored the do not disturb sign a few days later and broke into the room. I'm not sure if that's how the Paris outbreak started, though it would make sense. You say they didn't call for a doctor, that they were afraid they'd be sent back, but then why try to find a cure in the West? You really don't understand a refugee's heart, do you? These people were desperate. They were trapped between the infections and being rounded up and treated by their own government. If you had a loved one, a family member, a child, who was infected and you thought there was a shred of hope in some other country, wouldn't you do whatever you could in your power to get there? Wouldn't you want to believe there was hope? You said that man's wife, along with the other Renshi, vanished into thin air? Yes, it has always been this way, even before the outbreaks. Some stay with family, some with friends. Many of the poorer ones had to work off their bow to the local Chinese mafia, and the majority of them simply melted into the host country underbelly. You mean the low-income areas? Well, if that's what you want to call them, what better place to hide than among that part of society that no one even wants to acknowledge? How else could so many outbreaks have started in so many first world ghettos? It's been said that many Shentu propagated the myth of a miracle cure in some other countries. Some, perhaps. Well, did you? No. Okay. How did Flight 575 change air smuggling? Well, the restrictions were tightened, but only in certain countries. Airline Shentu were careful, but they were also resourceful. They used to have this saying, every rich man's house has a servant's entrance. Well, what does that mean? It means, if Western Europe has increased its security, go through Eastern Europe. If the US won't let you in, go through Mexico. I'm sure it helped make the rich white communities feel safer, even though they had infections already bubbling within their borders. This is not my area of expertise, you will remember. I was primarily land transport, and my target countries were Central Asia. Well, were they easier to enter? They practically begged for the business. Those countries were in such economic shambles, their officials were so backwards and corrupt, they actually helped us with the paperwork in exchange for a percentage of our fee. There were even Shetu, or whatever they called them in their barbarian babble, who worked with us to get Renshi across the old Soviet republics into countries like India or Russia, even Iran. Although I never asked or wanted to know where any of the Renshi were going. My job ended at the border. I just get their papers stamped, their vehicles tagged, pay the guards off, and take my cut. Did you see many infected? Not in the beginning. The blight worked too fast. It wasn't like air travel. It might take weeks to reach Kashi, and even the slowest burns, I've been told, couldn't last longer than a few days. Infected clients usually reanimated somewhere on the road, where they would be recognized and collected by the local police. Later, as infections multiplied and the police became overwhelmed, I began to see a lot of infected on my route. Were they dangerous at all? Rarely. Their family usually had them bound and gagged. You'd see something moving in the back of a car, squirming softly under clothes or heavy blankets, or you hear banging from a car's boot, or later from crates with air holes in the back of the vans. Air holes! God, they really didn't know what was happening to their loved ones. Did you? By then, yes. But I knew trying to explain it to them would be a hopeless cause. I just took their money and sent them on their way. I was lucky. I never had to deal with the problems of sea smuggling. So, was sea smuggling more difficult? Oh yes, and dangerous. Yes, and dangerous. My associates from the coastal provinces were the ones who had to contend with the possibility of an infected breaking its bonds and contaminating the entire hold. So, what did they do? I've heard of various solutions. Sometimes ships would pull up through a stretch of deserted coast. It didn't matter if it was the intended country or not. It could have been any coast. And they unload the infected Renshi onto the beach. I've heard some captains making for an empty stretch of open sea and just tossing the whole writhing lot overboard. That might explain the early cases of swimmers and divers starting to disappear without a trace, or why you'd hear a lot of people around the world saying they saw them walking out of the surf. At least I never had to deal with that. I did have one similar incident, the one that convinced me that it was time to quit. There was this truck, a beat-up old jalopy. You could hear the moans from the trailer. A lot of fists were slamming against the aluminum. It was actually swaying back and forth. In the cab, there was a wealthy investment banker from Zishan. He made a lot of money buying up American credit card debt, and he had enough to pay for his entire extended family. The man's Armani suit was rumpled and torn, and there were scratch marks down the side of his face, and his eyes had that frantic fire I was starting to see more every day. The driver's eyes had a different look. It was the same one as me, the look that maybe money wasn't going to be much good for much longer. I slipped the man an extra 50 and wished him good luck. That was all I could do. So where was the truck headed? It was headed to Kyrgyzstan.